You are listening to a Scarlet Shoot-Around exclusive interview. Here are your hosts, Blake and Mike.
Welcome into this special guest feature episode of the Scarlet Shoot-Around podcast, presented as always by our title sponsor, Tax and Business Consultants. Make sure to visit them this tax season for any tax planning or payroll needs you may have at www.taxandbusinessconsultants.com. We're joined today by the only three-time guest we've ever had on the Scarlet Shoot-Around podcast. That is our very own T3 Bracketology. How are you doing today, my friend? Great to have you back with us.
I'm doing well. Excited to talk a little bit about Nebraska basketball. And as you were saying, the whole three-time thing there was bringing me back to like the Miami Heat, Dwayne Wade, LeBron James, not one, not two, not three. Maybe next year's four. We'll see how it's going, if it's an exciting season again. But pumped to talk about Nebraska and not have to worry about jinxing anything this year. So looking forward to it.
A little bit of an Easter egg there for our past listeners. But for those that don't know, the last 2 years you've had T3 on, they were both bubble situations. So we're trying to draw out plans of how we get in the tournament, who we have to beat, who we can't lose to. This year has a little bit of a different spin on it, as Nebraska was the first team that T3 locked in the entire country. So very unique and special opportunity for us. I don't know if you're making any shirts or anything, but I'm sure they'd sell like hotcakes if you did. That being said, maybe a marketing opportunity. But on that note, T3, when we first had you on the show 2 years ago, you had around 10,000 followers, give or take. You're now up to nearly 65,000. How have the past few years of growth been as you've been doing this? And I know you're media credentialed in some spots. Just walk us through the growth of the past couple of years that you've had.
Yeah, it's been a blast, really. I mean, I don't know if I, a couple years ago, shared the origin story, if you will, of how this all got started. But I mean, I had been doing bracketology myself in a notebook and in my own Excel all the way back to when I was 16, 17 years old. So 12 or 13 years now I've been doing that. So you guys can do the math on what that age means for the listeners out there for me today. But I created the Twitter page in 2019 just for my friends and family to follow along with my thoughts. I didn't have any goal like, oh, I'm going to have this many followers. I'm going to be credentialed media. I'm going to travel to this. I'm going to do that, like join shows like this. Like I just was doing it because my friends and family. I was like, I don't want to send 60 texts. I'm just going to tweet it out. You guys can follow it. And it ended up blossoming into where it is today. I think the coolest part probably about getting this much growth is probably the confidence that comes with it in like, you're doing the right stuff. And it's opened more to me too for some flexibility. I love conversations like this about bracketology and where teams are going to go. I'm a math nerd with love of basketball, so those mix really well together for this, but I think it's created. I love mid-major basketball too. Last year we talked about Omaha and the exciting season they were having a little bit on the show. Not as much this year, still fun in pockets, but I'm actually going to the Summit League tournament this year, so I'll get to see them in person at that, along with St. Thomas, who's local for me, and their first opportunity for the tournament. So a lot of those things have opened up flexibility and like, all right, I've got enough of a following, let's try this out. Like there's less risk in there because you have enough of a base. So I think that's been the most exciting part of some of the flexibility and content that I can do, but it's always humbling too. It's like I never thought I could fill up like a decent Power 5 football stadium with people. Like that's just kind of nuts to me. I think about it, but it's still very cool. Like I didn't even realize it had been that big of a jump in 2 years either. So thanks for saying that. It's awesome. Like I'm on the same run as Nebraska basketball, I guess. Bubble team, and now I'm at 65. Like who knows? Call me the Jamarcus Lawrence of college. I don't know, whatever it is, but very cool stuff for sure.
Yeah, and I can only imagine how that feels. I know Blake and I always talk about how crazy it is to have, the amount of followers we have, and that pales in comparison to you. Like we're lucky to fill up I don't even know what stadium holds 2,000 people, Blake, but
there's plenty of mid-major ones. I mean, multiple thousands still sick. Like you can't.
Yeah, no, and it's something we always talk about. We feel blessed all the time that people want to listen to a couple guys just ramble about Husker basketball for whatever reason. So yeah, I can only imagine. Speaking of Nebraska basketball, obviously historic season this year, crazy start, 20-0, had the longest win streak in the nation for a while there, going back to the Crown last year. And all that has them in a hunt for a top 16 seed at the tournament for the first time in 35 years. With that comes some questions, specifically from Jared Garcia fan and Matt Rosso, who ask if you can explain how the geographically protected seeds work with the committee and how those sites are determined. Is it as the crow flies? Is it driving distance? Like what goes into all that geographically protected nonsense that we're all brand new to here at Nebraska?
Yeah, for sure. So when you're within the top 16 First off, from like a who goes where perspective, it really operates like a probably the best comparison would be like a fantasy football snake draft. I'm sure a lot of listeners probably participate in some sort of fantasy sport thing where it's a snake draft. So at the top, if you think about like a like the true seed list, so it's the actual seed number that you are is a little bit less relevant here outside of the one seeds. The one seeds have two questions to answer. Where are they going to go for their first two rounds, assuming they win the first one? That initial geographic preference, which is what I'm sure Nebraska fans are most interested in, but then also what region are they going to go in? So one seed's trying to go all the way to the Final Four. So they're going to be South, Midwest, East, West. Like that's the secondary part where once you get outside the one seeds, you also have to follow some bracketing principles, and that's a whole thing for probably another day. But in terms of the top 16 and where you're going to be at regionally, it does have to do with like it goes down in the seed list order. What's the closest to you from the NCAA's perspective? I believe it is driving distance. So for Nebraska this year, it's Oklahoma City and St. Louis, which I'm sure every single person that's listening to this knows those are the top two. After that, it's like 1,000 miles away for each other option. It's like a Buffalo, Greenville, like not ideal, not where you guys probably want to be in terms of traveling to watch the game, but it goes in that order first. And then in terms of the locations, it just like the actual locations, like the fact that it's Oklahoma City and St. Louis this year, it just rotates each year based on who's available to host, which venues are options, which ones have done well in the past. A lot of them end up repeating, but it does just kind of rotate, and it's done years in the past, just like a Final Four venue would be. A couple, 2-3 years in advance, they decide, all right, these are the sites for, in this case, the 2026 tournament.
So just to clarify, when you talk about what Nebraska is looking at geographically, does the geographically protected seat aspect apply to the regionals and the first and second round sites, or mainly just the regionals and everything else from top to bottom, 1 to 68, is based on driving distance?
Yeah, so for the top 16, it's just looking at like those first two rounds. So the pod that you're in, the actual region that you get placed in is going to be a lot more dependent on bracketing principles. So as an example, if Nebraska is a 2 seed, ideally speaking, it could be a little different because there's a lot of Big Ten teams hanging around the 2 seed. So if some weird scenario happens and there's 4 Big Ten 2 seeds, then this is impossible. But let's pretend that's not the case. The ideal situation is they don't want a 1 and a 2 seed from the same conference. So Michigan's likely a 1 seed. They don't want to put Nebraska in the same pod as Michigan, even if they both prefer to be in the same region. Michigan gets preference on region. Then Nebraska's like, okay, well, they can't go to Michigan, so then what's the next one they go to? And that's going to be in seed list order. Then when you start to get lower, let's say Nebraska in a different hypothetical is a 3 or a 4 seed, another aspect of it that's very important is what's called regional balance. And that's only a factor for the top 16. Once you get to the 5s and below, it's just based on geographical region. And then also you can't have repeat matchups in the second round. Sometimes it happens now with super conferences, but especially if a team hasn't played each other twice, they don't want to have them play until at least the Sweet 16. But for the top 16, they want regional balance too. So that's really important, really outside the top 2 seeds, which what that basically means is if you add up the overall number 1 through 16 in each of the 4 regions, they want that to be as close to each other as possible. So if you think about a region that's like the number 1 overall, 6 overall, 9 overall, which would be at that point 16, and then 15 overall, so 31. They want all the other regions to be close to 31 when adding those 4 numbers together. So that's going to shift then where teams go, like especially the 4 seeds. You might get your preferred or second or third best first 2 round sites, but what actual region you go into is going to be factored into what conference do you play in, that 1 seed that's in there, and then also how is that going to balance the regions out based on just the overall actual number. But that's more of a factor with the 3s and 4s in the top 16. The 1s and 2s, it's mostly just, for Nebraska's case, where's Michigan at? Probably not going to be there unless there's 4 2 seeds that are from the Big Ten, which would probably require a pretty big rise from Michigan State to be the 4th one up there. But beyond that, it's mostly just focused on like the regional preference in the pod for the first 2 games.
Gotcha. Now, a lot of Nebraska basketball fans that have been listening to us over the past 2 years as you've joined us are pretty well aware of what kind of goes into a resume. But with this crazy historical year that Nebraska has had, I'm sure there's a lot of new fans that are kind of new to this bracketology stuff and how teams are examined on a resume and predictive metric basis and all that kind of stuff. So just briefly, for the new people that are following this stuff, what all goes into a team's resume and how does the net play into that as, very important, a sorting tool, not a ranking?
Yeah, so that's the part that gets a little bit confusing for some folks. I mean, obviously, I'm not sitting in the room with the committee, so I don't know for sure, but I haven't seen any true, there's obviously examples people can pinpoint, but a true correlation to seed and selection with net. Really, the most successful, if you just wanted to make it a math equation, is looking at the 6 metrics across the board, averaging that out, and what's the seed. There's much more that goes into that, and those 6 metrics, there's 3 predictive, that's Ken Palm, Torvik, and then BPI on ESPN's website. And then there's 3 resume-based metrics or result-based metrics, however you want to word it, which is wins above bubble or WAB, WAB, for what I pronounce. That's the brand new one, second year of that. And there's also KPI and then strength of record. So those are the 6 across the board. I personally noticed last year there was a bit of an emphasis on wins above bubble in the result-based area. If people remember like an Oregon or a Memphis, which is a much more extreme version of Nebraska, but it's where the result-based metrics are much better than the predictive metrics. And both those teams got a bump because they had good wins above bubble. So if you averaged out their seeds, they were more like 6, 7, 8 seeds. They got 5s. So that's a little bit different in that range, but those are the 6 metrics across the board. Then obviously your opponent's net is probably the most important. That's going to factor in how many wins do you have in quad 1, quad 2, then quad 3 and 4 is mostly focused, especially at this range, on the losses, which is not an issue at the moment for Nebraska. And then the last thing is a little bit smaller factor. It's more of a tiebreaker in my opinion, but it's your strength of schedule and non-conference strength of schedule, and especially the non-conference strength of schedule. I think if a team has an extremely good one or an extremely bad one, at times that can be a tiebreaker on 8 versus 9 overall, 16 versus 17 overall, like those cut lines on seeds where they say, I really can't have a big difference, and we want to reward this team for playing a tough schedule, or we're going to penalize this one for not playing as tough a schedule. And then there's obviously much more double-clicking way deeper, but at simplest point, it's really factored in the metrics, what are your quad records, and then strength of schedule. That's the simplest way to put it.
It sounds pretty complex for that being simple, but that's what goes into selecting teams.
I mean, I have a full. I like to use spreadsheets and stuff too, but I also, when it gets this jumbled, and my new seed list comes out on Fridays, at least until it's once a week. Then it's Mondays and Fridays. Once it's twice a week for the Saturday. And when it gets this jumbled in groups, spreadsheet gets so small for me that I actually still will use a full notebook, and that's where I write out things deeper. So a lot of the numbers I just talked about, but then I'm someone that really feels like there's a trend in the strength of your road wins and non-conference wins, and I'm writing out and wins against the tournament teams. So I'm writing out those individually because I'm bucketing in like, all right, let's compare Nebraska versus Kansas versus Iowa State versus Illinois versus Purdue, and I'm like, what, I want 7 tabs open? I can just make this in a bunch of lines in a notebook, and it's a little bit bigger, and when you write it out, you can remember it a little bit easier. And so I was actually doing that just before this anyways, which is very timely for this conversation, but there's definitely a lot more into it. But the 6 metrics are probably the most important trend that correlates over the years.
And as we look at resumes and wins, like you said, Nebraska thankfully doesn't have to worry about losses too much, but their wins that they've had, and you look at old wins that have matured or improved, how much does the committee really put weight into like a Q2 win versus net 51 versus like a Q1 win versus like net 49? Do they really get into the minutia of it? Like looking at, those teams are only 2 spots different in the net, but it's a Q1 versus a Q2. Does that make a big difference?
Again, not in the room specifically with them, but my personal opinion on it is I don't think that makes almost any different at all. Like I don't think that the game of getting into the tournament and seeding is a quad 1 competition. I mean, there's some team like Houston's a very good example. They might not have the same number of depth of quad 1 wins as somebody else that's lower than them, but their metrics are so elite and they've got enough in there for the committee to go, yeah, they got wins to back up the fact that their metrics say they're a top 5 team. So they're probably top 6 in the seed list. They might have less Q1 wins. Oh, there's a road win that's 77 and top 75 is quad 1. But another thing that's been emphasized too, and I've always been skeptical committee member to committee member, is they've mentioned a lot that like the wins you have within each quad are important, that they do look at that. So a good example would be a home win against Wisconsin. I believe you guys have a home win against Wisconsin. That's technically a quad 2 win for now if they keep playing really well. I think they're like 35, 36, 37. So they're getting close to 30. But like I look at that for myself and I'm like, that's a win over a single digit tournament team. As opposed to let's use a Miami, Florida as an example, where before they got the win against North Carolina, they're not being compared to Nebraska at all, but before they got the win against North Carolina a couple days ago, they had a couple quad one wins, but it was road wins against like Wake Forest. Realistically speaking, a home win against Wisconsin is better than a road win against an 11-13 or 11-14 Wake Forest. But one of them's quad one and one of them's quad two. So like that's where they do make that emphasis if we're looking at the wins in each quad. It's the same thing of like if anyone goes and does double click into NC State's resume, they've got 8 quad two wins. There's only one of them that's really worth anything. Like at its absolute core, that's a tournament team. I think it's SMU. If I'm remembering correctly, it could be somebody different. They might have had that one on the road, but regardless, there's one win in there, but it says they have 8. There's more to it in that aspect, and that's where I don't think that I think it's more so like the perception. Like the perception of Wisconsin is increasing a ton. They have 2 insane road wins. You guys beat them by 30 points. That's just now good regardless. Whether they end up at 29 or they're 33, like it's a win over a single-digit seed in the tournament. To me, I don't really see that as a huge, unless you have 0 quad one wins, which is not your guys' problem. But like maybe like a St. Mary's team, they have 0. Like then it means a lot because it's just the optics of like you have 0. But you guys are not hunting in those waters this year, so it's not really a big deal. You got plenty quad one, quad two wins, so it's not a problem.
And the nice thing about the difference between this year's resume and 2 years' resume, when obviously they were chasing the bubble with the Keisei Tominaga team, is they waited until after when we'd be recording this now, after February 12th. It was February 21st, as Mike quoted a couple episodes ago in our podcast, that they found their first big road win. So, it's nice to have a lot of those under the belt, and I'm sure played a huge role into your decision to lock us earlier than a lot of other teams. Now, the selection committee T3 is going to release their top 16 teams here later this month. Where do you expect Nebraska to land on that list, and how much is that going to change as we get closer to Selection Sunday?
So my expectation of where that goes actually has a lot to do with the next 2 games that Nebraska plays. So you have a game on, I think it's Saturday against Northwestern, which is another one of those ones, which now technically is a quad 2 game. Northwestern is plenty capable of, they had Michigan for a while, a couple days ago. Like they've got Nick Martinelli, they're a solid basketball team, but like whether that's quad 2, whatever, like losing at home to Northwestern would not be ideal. If you lose to Northwestern at home, you're not going to be a 2 seed next. The reveal is February 21st, so a week from Valentine's Day this Saturday. So if you lose to Northwestern, I can pretty much guarantee you're not going to be top 8. Assuming you win that game, it's at home. Nebraska been playing well. Northwestern might have used up a lot of their good mojo against Michigan, and then they got worn down because they lost. I think the key one is you play at Iowa in the middle of next week. And while Iowa's been a little bit up and down, like that's a pretty solid team, tournament team, and it's on the road, which always enhances metrics. And you'd have to think some of those teams that you guys are punching with for a 2 seed, like they all have tough schedules. Someone's going to drop a game. So I think if you win the next 2, obviously it's dependent on a lot of other results. My gut would be you'd be sitting somewhere at like 7 or 8 overall in the list, where if you beat Northwestern and lost to Iowa, I could see like 9 or 10. There's a pretty significant gap right now between 12 and 13 overall. 13th, for reference for people, for me today is Gonzaga, who just lost to Portland recently. There's nothing you can do in the next 2 games that's like losing to Portland. And there's nothing Gonzaga can do. They're not playing St. Mary's or Santa Clara in that stretch, so there's nothing they're going to do that's going to move the needle enough. So it's not going to be lower than a 3 by next Saturday. I think you're sitting at like at worst 11 if you go in 0-2 in the stretch. Lost to Northwestern. That probably then stays Q2, so it doesn't look as bad. Lose at Iowa, which won't really drop you at all. That's kind of a house money game at this point. It's really more to help you get to a 2. So I think the Iowa game is a swing game. I think you're sitting at a 2 seed, 7 or 8. If not, probably sitting anywhere from like 10 or 11.
So as you mentioned a minute ago, T3, and what goes into seeding, you mentioned non-conference strength of schedule. That Husker fan was curious about how Nebraska's non-conference strength of schedule will weigh in, as Nebraska has the 314th ranked non-con strength of schedule. Is it really that bad, or how much weight will the committee put into that aspect of their resume, given they have plenty of Q1 wins already?
Kind of as I mentioned before, I think in Nebraska's case, because they have a lot there, I feel like I've noticed it be a much bigger factor on the bubble. It can keep a team out. They have a couple good wins, but their strength of schedule's in their non-conference strength of schedule's in the 300s. If you think about like a Miami, Ohio right now, that could go undefeated and lose 1 game, and it's like, are they in? They played the 360th out of 365. Some of that wasn't their fault, but like that's a factor. That's going to play a role. When you're up there with the 2s and 3s, like I think a really good example is maybe 2 years ago. I think it was Iowa State, who's in the same range now. They had a sub 300 non-conference strength of schedule, and they got penalized for that. They were a low 2 seed when a lot of people thought they were close to a 1, which is maybe around where Nebraska's hovering today. They could be anywhere from 6th to 10th overall, so they're in that same range about. But I've always noticed that if a team has something of substance in their non-conference, but a poor non-conference strength of schedule, those can offset a bit. And right now, you guys have the New Mexico win. New Mexico won last night at Grand Canyon, which was a technically Q1. I mean, Grand Canyon's not bad, but like that helped New Mexico boost them a bit. They're hanging in the bubble. So you have a win over a bubble team in the non-conference. That's like, all right, it's fine. You did something. You'd be surprised how many teams have absolutely jack nothing. Like you beat a bubble team in the non-conference. But as I mentioned before, like if it's truly just deadlocked, they can't tell, and you're competing like, which you're not right now, but a team that's rising quick is like a Florida, who also didn't do a whole lot in the non-conference because they lost to TCU and a couple other teams that were in the mix in there, but their non-conference strength of schedule is top 25. So their overall record's likely going to be worse than Nebraska, but do they give them the bump there because they already have great predictive metrics? They played a tough schedule. That's why they have some more losses. If it's like neck and neck tight, they're both relatively close in win percentage in Q1. That's really the only situation where it would come into a huge factor. But I think when you're up there with the top seeds, it's not as big of a deal. I think the bubble is where, which can understand why that's a question for the Nebraska faithful, but like you guys are punching in a different area this year. It's not, you have a good win in the non-conference. When you're looking at that, like New Mexico's fine. You got a lot, like you said, you got a lot of other good wins, including on the road, and enough opportunities left. There's still 3 good road teams to play. So I think it's really, if it's like just deadlocked and it's like, oh, we got 9th overall and we're a 3 seed instead of a 2, and it could come down to that, but not as big of a factor as the bubble.
Yeah, go figure the year Nebraska is having a historic season. Creighton misses the tournament for the first time in whatever, 7 years. We went to Kansas City expecting Mississippi State to kind of be the crown jewel of that tournament. Well, turns out it just so happened to be Nebraska, and we played New Mexico, and what we thought was like, this team's not going to do anything. Well, now they're a Q1 win. So it's just, you never really know how these things are going to shake out in the non-conference. But with that said, Nebraska had a great start to the season, as alluded to in the 11-0 non-conference. Only 3 losses to this point. Bode Suckup's Mustache asks, what is Nebraska's realistic ceiling and floor as far as seeding for this year in the tournament?
Realistically speaking, to me, just where like the predictive metrics sit now, and if you truly went like winless in the like Iowa, USC, UCLA, and you also lost at home to Iowa, like if you just won the other 3 home games and you lost the 4 toughest games and you finished 3-4, like I think that's probably a 5 seed. I just think the 6 seeds, to me, when I've been looking at them, they're just weak. And I just don't know if and there's a lot of ACC teams in there, which the ACC is better this year, but like a lot of times you're playing bubble teams. I just don't know if they're going to do enough to build up with what Nebraska's already done. So it feels like a 5 seed is the floor unless you lost like one of those 2 against Penn State and Maryland that are sitting on the schedule, like one of those ones. We're talking about like Minnesota last year, like don't lose. Like those ones would not be ideal. Like Northwestern would be like, it's not very fun. That really hurts the 2 seed chances. But like Penn State and Maryland, like you lose one of those ones, that's the only way I'd even entertain a 6 seed. And that's if you lost all the other opportunities. Like you beat Northwestern, one of those 2, lost the rest. Maybe then it's like 21st overall, 6 seed. But like I feel like 5 seeds the floor, and I think the ceiling's a 2. I think the 1 seeds have separated a bit. It's mostly predictive metric wise, which can be really frustrating, I know, for fans, because it just feels like there is a little bit of that goes into it where you beat a bad team by a lot of points, and you guys played a decent Winthrop team as an example in the non-conference who very well could be in March Madness, and you guys get to avoid them because you played them already, so that's great because they could easily upset someone as a 13 or 14 seed. Like those kind of things add up over time. Like Arkansas is going through something similar. They also played Winthrop. Some of those games catch up to you, but still feel like predictive metric-wise where you guys are at, like in the teens, low teens. Nebraska's been better than that, so it's a little frustrating, but that's why I cap it at a 2. Just hard to imagine a 1, especially with how Houston's been playing recently. That now adds 5 teams for 4 spots that are significantly higher metrically than all those other teams kind of jumbled in that 2-seed race.
So discussing that area, that range that you said there, I know every Husker fan's probably hoping for a 2 seed. Bode Suckup's Mustache is wondering what other resumes are comparable to Nebraska right now, and how far have those other historic teams that are comparable, or even teams that you feel like currently are playing right now, how far do you feel like those teams either have gone or can go in the tournament?
So the way I actually kind of thought about and really think about this one is less about the resume for me, because there's not really a lot of historical examples that show like, oh, this team has this many quad one wins and they went this far. Like every year, like as an example, like Wake Forest in the 60s, we talked about that on the road. Like that's a quad one win, but that doesn't really doesn't tell me how good you could be. So it's really hard to tell that. So I actually looked a little bit more on where your Ken Palm numbers are as of now. You have a very close to a top 10 defense. And statistically speaking, over multiple years, it would even out to like top 15, top 20. And the offense, depending on the year, would fall anywhere in like the 30s or high 40s or low 40s. It's like anywhere from 30 to 42 or so. It's where your offensive like efficiency rating would go. Historically speaking, teams with a better defense, less offense, can be more susceptible to the second round loss only if they're playing against like a top 15 offense. So if you're looking for teams, if you're thinking you're a 2 or 3 seed and people are like creating their dream bracket, who are the 6 or 7 seeds, you can just take a look and go look at like who are those best offensive teams that are sitting in that range. And that's not to say Nebraska couldn't beat them. They already beat like an Illinois as an example, split that. And that's a very good offensive team. But historically speaking, those teams normally get to about the Sweet 16. I think traditionally speaking, the ones that are in those, like in Arkansas last year, where their offense is better than the defense, they can go on the surprise a little bit further. But a lot of that is going to have to do with the draw that Nebraska gets. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, that 6 seed looks dangerous. And then they lose to the 11 seed in the first round. You're like, well, we're not playing them. It doesn't matter. Or the 1 seed goes down to the 8. And you're like, oh, man, UConn, as an example, they look tough. They lose to 8 seed Wisconsin, who's proven they can beat anybody, and they get hot. And now it's like, well, we beat Wisconsin by 30. We're going to play that like – so things can be a lot differently. But historically speaking, most of those teams make it to the Sweet 16. So I would say that's probably the best answer to the question. Once you get beyond that, it's like, what does the bracket look like? Is there some crazy 12s? Like sometimes they just blow up and it's like 3 double-digit seeds are in the Sweet 16. It's like, well, now you're the favorite to go to the Final Four. Or it's like you're in the region of death and it's all these tough teams and you're like, now you're playing against a 10 seed that's red hot. Like, okay, well, that's tough. Like, who knows what's going to happen? So that's a little bit more on like the variance, but generally speaking, it's about Sweet 16.
And a Sweet 16 obviously would be unbelievable for this fan base. It's very well documented, have never won a single tournament game, as our rivals like to tell us. However, they will not be in this tournament, so I think they're a little bit quieter this year. This is a riveting conversation to have. We're going to take a really quick ad break, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Hey, Nebraska fans. February is here, and so are your taxes. While you're cheering for the Huskers, who's got your businesses back? Tax and Business Consultants. With locations in Blair, Columbus, and Lyons, we've got you covered with expert tax planning, bookkeeping, and payroll services. Whether you're a small business owner or managing your personal taxes, let's take care of the numbers so you can focus on what really counts. Visit www.tbc.tax today and score a win for your financial future.
You are listening to the Scarlet Shoot-Around Podcast.
Here we go.
Welcome back into the Scarlet Shoot-Around Podcast again here with guest interviewee, third-time repeat offender here, T3 Bracketology, joining us again here for a very different style and vibe of an interview this time around as Nebraska hunting around the top 16 seeds in the country. T3 J Crew 23 asks, how much are predictive metrics holding Nebraska back with their seeding as compared to their resume metrics?
Yeah, kind of alluded to this a little bit before, but that's definitely the biggest factor. I think when you're focusing on some teams that are either below Nebraska today, maybe for sure 3 seeds, not in that 2 seed conversation, Florida being the best example, or some other ones below that have really good predictive metrics, all it's going to take is a couple good wins for them to have top, let's call it 12 resume metrics to be in the hunt to be a 2 seed, and that's going to make it pretty tough. With Nebraska's already had so many good wins and the predictive metrics are what they are, it's hard to imagine they're going to be any better than like 10 on average across the 3 of them. And that's why it's kind of caps the seed at a 2 seed at best, keeps it away from a 1 seed. So it's definitely holding them back, but it's not keeping Nebraska out of any 2 or 3 seed conversations by any means.
Something you kind of touched on earlier is the remaining games left. You know, Nebraska still has a few good opportunities, especially on the road against Iowa, USC, and UCLA. Cole Burns wants to know, what record would you feel comfortable with in order for Nebraska to be on the 3 seed line? And what record would make you feel comfortable about 2 seed line? Obviously, what wins those are, what losses those are matter. But in general, what kind of record would you feel comfortable with for a 3 seed versus a 2 seed?
So I think it's 7 games left. Obviously, for a 3 seed, you got a lot more margin for error. So on a 3 seed wise, I do feel like we mentioned already, I do feel like it will require Penn State and Maryland. Like those two have to be won in this mixture. I think it's probably winning the home games, like 4-3, and I think you're very competitive. It's going to require some of those 4 seed lines to get hotter. There's still a month left, but there is a gap between 12th and 13th overall to me, which is the cut line between the 3 and the 4 seeds. I think 4-3 would make Nebraska very competitive. I think 5-2 is probably the most ideal. You win one of those road games, those 3 you mentioned. For a 2 seed, that's going to be extremely dependent on all those teams hunting in the mix that are in that area. 5-2 still feels like you're very competitive for that spot. It's definitely probably going to require one of these other road games just to help with metrically hang around in that resume area. And I just keep looking at Florida. I just feel like Florida is destined for a 2 seed. So that's going to take someone's spot. I don't think the top 5 teams, the current 1 seeds in Houston, are going to drop off the 2 seed line. So that's going to leave 2 spots left, and Kansas apparently can be just fine without Darren Peterson playing at all. So that doesn't make sense, but they almost seem better sometimes. So like there's a lot of those factors in there. So I would say 5-2 at least. Ideally, you'd like to go 6-1, probably drop one. It's tough to beat a team twice, so it's either like losing one in LA, which is a tough road trip, but Nebraska's not as far as like the East Coast teams have to go. So Nebraska's definitely much better than those 2 teams. So I think that would be doable, and maybe you just lose the game to Iowa on the road. So I would say 6-1, you'd feel really good. 5-2, you're certainly in the mix, but it's going to require some help.
Now, if they go 7-0, are they like a write-in? If they just sweep the rest of the way, win all the road games, obviously the big ones, would you feel, I mean, are they pretty much penciled in as a 2 seed in your opinion then?
It would require all those other teams also winning the remaining games, which for some of them are not possible, like Kansas and Iowa State, who are in that same area for you, they have to play each other. I think they even play each other the next like 4 days. But they might play each other again in like the Big 12 tournament quarterfinals or something. So like odds are it's not going to make a huge difference. And it's also an interesting note too on the Big 10 tournament, which still ways away, but that does not have as big of an impact on these decisions as like the bubble conversations we've had in the past. Like a great example in your own conference last year was Purdue and Michigan. Michigan beat Purdue late. Their metrics took a huge jump late in the Big 10 tournament. Michigan was still a 5, Purdue was a 4. Because they make a lot of those initial seed decisions on like Wednesday and Thursday of championship week. Nebraska's probably going to play their first game. I don't know how the bracket works, either Thursday or Friday. So it's somewhere in there. So like they've probably already seeded Nebraska where they're going to be at. They'd have to lose to like one of these really bad teams that goes on a run, wins 3 games, and let's just use Maryland. They win a couple games in a row, then they end up playing Nebraska instead of a better team. Then that could factor in there, but 7-0, it would take like some insane, like Florida wins out, and they're blowing teams out too on the process of it to help with those resume numbers, and Kansas wins out, and like Purdue wins out because you guys don't play Purdue the rest of the way. Then maybe, but like what are the odds of that? Pretty low. So I would say 7-0. Like you have 3 losses to really good teams, so I can't see how that's not a 2 seed.
I think that makes a lot of people feel better. And I'm glad you touched on the conference tournament because it's always kind of a conversation, at least amongst people that aren't heavily involved in the bracketology, of saying, oh, well, you know, we beat this team in the conference tournament and maybe you pick up an extra Q1 neutral win. We've always kind of assumed, and I assume you guys, after doing this for so many years, you have found that they really don't weight those results very much. Now, like you said, it's very interesting if Nebraska were to play some team that runs out of nowhere, a Minnesota team, for example, that wins 3 straight games and Nebraska finds himself playing them and God forbid they lose that game. We may see something on that side of things, but it's good to know that really once you get to that conference tournament, you're kind of baked in. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, at least at the top of the, like where Nebraska's going to be at the top 4 or 5 seed lines. I mean, and if you did end up playing one of those, like Minnesota could be a fine example, but even still, they're a Q2. That's not that bad. Like Maryland just beat Iowa the other day, so maybe it sparks them and they actually look good. Like if you played Maryland on Friday, it's just crazy that even matters, and I find it kind of dumb. I'd like every game to matter, and we just end it all on Saturday, no games on Sunday, and they could just make every game count. But that hasn't happened historically. Friday and Saturday games just don't weigh a whole lot unless they're truly just like deadlocked. And it's like, okay, this team made it to the Big Ten championship game, and maybe you're competing right for a spot with Iowa State, and they lost on Friday at the Big 12 tournament. And you make it to the championship game, which will unfortunately mean nothing for seeding. I think every Big Ten fan knows that. They already made the bracket. Unless there's like a Maryland in there. Watch Maryland just win out now. I've mentioned them like 6 times. But if Maryland's in there, obviously, they're not making the tournament unless they win the Big Ten. So now obviously they got to have their contingency and all that stuff. But like Penn State a couple years ago went on a nice run, no seed bump at all. FAU 2 years ago, they were a nice 9 seed. They lost to Temple, who was trying to lose games with the whole gambling situation. Didn't drop, 9 seed. And they lost on Saturday. And then that one's just crazy too, because that Temple team literally came out that they're like, yeah, they didn't even want to win. They beat FAU, and FAU was still a 9 seed. I was penalized. I'm like, I dropped into a low 10, and it was like, oh, I mean, they lost to Temple. I mean, this team stinks. They don't even have 10 wins. Meant nothing. They were still a 9. So there's too many examples of it the opposite way. I think Michigan and Purdue last year in your guys' range, top 4 seed is a perfect example. Michigan beat Purdue late. They didn't care. They kept Purdue as a 4, even though the metrics alternated to Michigan being better. So where you're at going into that championship week is probably where you're going to be at in terms of rising, lowering. Going to be, unless something nuts happens, probably going to be in that spot.
Yeah, like I said, really good to know and have that security and not be scared of a potential seed penalty if something crazy like that were to happen. Trent Peterson says, T3, that you are one of his favorite Twitter follows, actually. If Nebraska is a 3 seed, what are the % chances they end up in Oklahoma City or St. Louis? And if not there, where are the most likely sites for Nebraska?
So this one is interesting, and I anticipated this question coming in because I've gotten a lot of questions about it. And so I've actually looked at it myself. And it really, if we think back to a couple questions ago about the process for the top 16, because it just goes in order of your seed number or your overall number, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 through 16, the actual seed doesn't matter too much. It's who you're fighting against in range. And it all comes down to like the top 2 to 3 destinations based on the driving distance from the school to that location and where that's at. So to answer the second part first, which is less fun, the most likely scenario for Nebraska if they don't get the top 2, I think is Buffalo. I don't really want to be in Buffalo. The next one after that's Greenville. I think Buffalo is just under 1,000 miles away. Greenville is 1,000. I don't think there's a scenario where you're going to be anywhere beyond those. There's 8 technically options. Almost everyone gets top 4 that's in the top 4 seats. So obviously Buffalo and Greenville is not ideal. So after seeing that myself, I'm like, I get the obsession with the top 2 because no one wants to go to Buffalo or Greenville, especially like as a Nebraska fan where you're all probably traveling from that area. So what's interesting when I'm looking at the teams in the range, your number 1 option, you don't really get a choice on this. It's based on geographic distance. Oklahoma City is number 1 for Nebraska. St. Louis number 2. When I thought in my own head, I'm like, I didn't realize Oklahoma City was that close to you guys. I thought St. Louis would be closer. Oklahoma City is much closer. So that's number 1 on the list, which is a good thing because there are a ton of teams in your guys' seed range that have St. Louis as the number 1 option. So if they're above you in the seed list, they're going to take St. Louis. But an interesting note too, before I'll get into like who these teams are and what the order is, because I think this is probably what's most intriguing to Nebraska fans, I would imagine. What's interesting to note too is because you also have to have your other grouping in the pod. So let's say Nebraska is a 2 seed, they're playing a 15. They also need to have the 7-10 game in their same group. So that takes up a number of availabilities. So in terms of this area, there's only 2 teams in the top 16 that are going to get Oklahoma City and 2 teams that are going to get St. Louis. So you've got to be in those top. If you want to have one of those 2 and you don't really care too much, especially because then the third option is Buffalo, you've got to make sure there's not 4 teams that have a top 2 of those above you in the list. And the tricky one's going to be St. Louis, which is your second option. So all that in mind, today currently, for hypothetical purposes, I have Nebraska sitting 9th overall on the seed list. You have Oklahoma City first, St. Louis second. The only other team in the top 8 that has Oklahoma City first is Houston. And it's very likely Houston's going to be above Nebraska on the seed list. It's going to take quite a collapse from just how they're playing, where their metrics are at. And they're the only team in the top 8 today. Iowa State's another one to watch. I have Iowa State below you guys at the moment, but they're certainly a team to watch. But the only team in the top 8 today that has Oklahoma City in their top 2. And you're probably not going to rise above Houston. So in terms of other teams that have Oklahoma City in their top 2 that you'd want to watch out for and cheer against, and again, it's not about the seeding area. It's the overall ranking, 1 through 16. So it's like if you're both 3 seeds, who's higher? That matters a ton in this case. So Iowa State's huge. They have Oklahoma State at number 2 on their list. St. Louis is their first, but here's some examples of teams that have also St. Louis first. Kansas, Illinois, and Purdue. All those teams have St. Louis first. And remember, there's only 2 St. Louis spots. So one of those teams is already getting bounced from St. Louis, and they're a 2 seed. You're thinking, oh, I'm a 2 seed, I'm getting my number 1. All these teams want St. Louis. But none of those teams have Oklahoma City second. So that's good. So that keeps it open. The only team that does is Iowa State, which where they're at right now. They're not getting St. Louis in that scenario. They're 4th for St. Louis. But if they were above, which some people might think they're above, that's certainly very close. I just gave the edge to Nebraska today. But then Iowa State would take Oklahoma City. Houston already took Oklahoma City. Those 2 are gone. Both the St. Louis is gone. Nebraska's headed to Buffalo, and you're like, this sucks. Why are we going to Buffalo? So that's definitely a factor in there. The 1 seeds are not really punching that area. Michigan would be somewhere different. UConn, Duke are on the east. Arizona's going to be in San Diego because no one else out there that wants to go there. So you're not really worried about those teams. Other ones to watch in the range 2, a little bit like Michigan State has St. Louis second, but I don't really feel like St. Louis is really what you guys are looking at. I feel like the most likely option is, because there's so many people fighting for St. Louis, Oklahoma City's the one that to get after. So other than Iowa State, the 2 that jumped out to me were Texas Tech and Arkansas. Neither of those teams are in range. I'm not even comparing them to Nebraska today. But we have a month of basketball left. Texas Tech's got Houston still, or Arizona still, this weekend. You beat Arizona, all of a sudden, boom, Texas Tech's in that same 3-seed comparison group. Arkansas they've been playing well. They got plenty of SEC opportunities. All of a sudden, they win out. They're in that same range. And they both have Oklahoma City first. So for Nebraska fans, you might not even be thinking about Texas Tech and Arkansas at the moment. But you want them to if you're watching Texas Tech, Arizona, you want to cheer for Arizona for a variety of reasons. But the biggest one being Texas Tech, if they beat Arizona, they're right in that range for a 3 seed. You guys lose to at Iowa next week, and now you're both right next to each other, and you both went Oklahoma City, and Houston's already taken one of the 2 spots. So I would say Texas Tech and Arkansas are the ones to look at. For the best opportunities, though, I would say a 2. If you're sitting as a 2 seed, I would say you're pretty much locked in. You're going to get one of your 2 spots. Just because I don't know if Arkansas and Texas Tech can get that high. I think they're probably going to be capped at a 3. So if you're a 2 seed, probably going to be looking at Oklahoma City. If you're 8th overall and Iowa State's above you, and it's Kansas and Illinois, then it gets tight. So Iowa State's the other one to look at too, as one that you probably want to make sure you're above in that scenario. But it's 100% guaranteed, did the math, if you're 7th overall or better. So that's the money area. 8th feels really good as long as Iowa State's not above you. So hopefully that clears things up. It's obviously a little bit more difficult without visual aid in this particular scenario, but hopefully and if any people that are listening to this too have more questions on this, I didn't realize how interesting I would think this was. I used to do this in its entirety, and I just kind of shifted to seedless the last few years, so I've kind of gotten out of it, and I'm it's kind of interesting. I don't know if I want to do this for 68 teams anymore, but for one example, it was kind of fun. So always happy to answer those questions if some of it didn't make sense without a visual part, but I know that's a hot topic. So cheer against Iowa State, Texas Tech, Arkansas. Those are the big 3 that really want Oklahoma City with you guys.
Perfect. That'll give a lot of guidance to Husker fans, as I'm sure we've all been wondering who we need to lose besides always cheering against Creighton. It's good to know who else we need to cheer against. For those that listened to this last year when we had you on, we were on the bubble. We were talking about what Nebraska needs to do to get in, and you mentioned one thing that they couldn't do, and that was losing to Minnesota. Lo and behold, they lost to Minnesota. And eventually got bounced from the tournament.
I still feel so bad about that. I shouldn't have said
anything.
It
happens. Yeah. It happens. Got bounced from the tournament, went onto the crown. Bryce Williams, Juwan Gary got to go out as champion, so that's always good. With the games left on the schedule that Nebraska has, are there any can't-lose games when you look at the remaining schedule for those 16s? I know you kind of mentioned already the Penn State and Maryland game. Is there anything else? Is it just really kind of those?
I would throw in that's relevant to the conversation we just had. If people really don't want to go to Buffalo, I would throw in Northwestern this weekend as well. It's just a lot of the teams in this area they have, and what's so nice about Nebraska's resume, and this feels like college football talk a little bit, but they got good losses. Not only have they lost to good teams, they've only lost to really good teams. I mean, Wisconsin's on the rise. They beat them by 30. They won at Indiana, who's playing better. Even those solid tournament teams that might be single digits, you still beat all those. You got really good losses, which is always kind of stupid, but when you're in the ones, it's a different sphere you guys are hanging in. 1, 2, 3 seeds. Eventually you got to pick something. And it's who lost to a non-tournament team? So you don't really want to do that, and that could you lose any of those 3 games, Northwestern, Penn State, and Maryland, and it's really unlikely you're going to get Oklahoma City or St. Louis. You could definitely still get a 3 seed, but it's probably going to be at the bottom of the 3 line. I think beyond that, they're all tournament teams, or the 2 LA teams are at least bubble teams. They're close enough, and it's on the road. So none of those are bad, but those are the ones that you definitely don't want to for like the dream scenario kind of ends where you can make up for a home loss to Iowa, a road loss to Iowa, splitting the LA trip. Like there's enough other stuff you can make up for it and be fine. You don't have to win out, but those other 3 are like, now you've lost to a team that's definitely not a tournament team, and most of these other teams in this mix, beyond like Gonzaga, who you're not competing with anyways for a geographical preference, don't have a loss to a non-tournament team, or at worst, it's like to a non-tournament bubble team, like a Texas, TCU, stuff like that. These 3 are not that at all. So they're like Northwestern's not bad, they're much better than their record, but like I would throw that one in there in the mix for the geographic representation. I don't think that one hurts you as bad for like top 3 seed quest, but like there's a lot of teams hanging in that mix for Oklahoma City that we just walked through that I think having a loss to Northwestern with the predictive metric issue, like that could put you at 12th overall, and now you're playing in Buffalo, which I really hope you're not playing in Buffalo. So
the one thing about Husker fans, especially the diehard basketball fans, is they would go to Egypt if it meant winning their first tournament game, I think.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, at least Buffalo's got Niagara Falls. So if it happens, this is the new don't lose to Minnesota, you guys end up in Buffalo, just think about Niagara Falls. All right? You were meant to go on a trip there. That's why you listened into this today. It was a scene in the stars. You had to go see Niagara Falls. I've been. It's really beautiful. So there's positives in there, just in case.
Yeah, the only thing it doesn't have is less snow probably at that time, which as native Nebraskans, and I believe you're a northerner, you understand the sentiment around that. So a lot of reasons to not want to have to go north to play a tournament game, but hopefully Nebraska can take care of that themselves, like you said, going 7-0 and pretty much securing that spot amongst the top 7 teams here in the country as we get to Selection Sunday. Thank you again so much, T3, for joining us. I think this is very informative for a lot of our fan base, both those that have followed us for a long time and maybe newer listeners that are more fresh to these ideas of bracketology and things like that. For the new people who are not familiar with who you are, where can they find your work on the internet?
Yeah, the best place to find all the different content that I put out is just on Twitter at T3 Bracketology. So I got all the different stuff there, post stuff in different forums. If people are looking for the best stuff, I realize not everyone is familiar. I really am a heavy utilizer of the highlights tab on my profile. That's where I keep old seed lists, old birth watch for the most recent stuff, mid-major top 32 if people like mid-major rankings as well. All that's in the highlights tab. So any Nebraska fans that want to see that. I realized a good portion of my followers didn't know that even existed on Twitter. So first podcast I've been on that's going to highlight the highlights tab, but best place at T3 Bracketology. No underscores or numbers or anything, just that, and that's where you can find me.
Thanks again, T3, for your time. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us here for what has become a yearly segment that I know all of our fan base looks forward to. So thanks again for taking some time out of your Thursday night to talk to us here about Nebraska basketball. Mike, we got a huge game here against Northwestern in the sense of not trying to go to Buffalo is going to be the new statement that we ride with here on our way out of the season. So with that said, for myself, Blake, co-host Mike, and T3, go Big Red.
Go Big Red, baby.